Welcome to the deep dive. We take your sources, plunge in, and pull out the most compelling insights for you. Today, we're tackling some truly foundational parts of human history. We're looking at the very origins of settled life, the, explosion of cities, that astonishing invention of writing, and the monumental rise of the first empires.
Yeah, it's quite a scope. We have material here that spans literally millions of years, but it really zeroes in on that pivotal moment, when small, scattered human groups started coming together into these complex urban societies and then eventually into large political structures. So our deep dive today is really about understanding how that profound transformation happened, and maybe more importantly, why the echoes of those ancient changes still shape our world today.
It's a massive story, right? I mean, from early human emergence, basic tools,
Mm-hmm.
all the way to sophisticated mathematics, vast libraries, complex trade routes. It's incredible. So let's unpack this journey and see what truly stands out from the sources you've shared with us.
Okay, so the sources kick off by reminding us about the immense timescale involved here. Humans emerged in Africa millions of years ago, and for the vast majority of that time, life was fundamentally nomadic. It was based on hunting and gathering.
That's right.
We're talking early reliance on incredibly basic tools, fire, the earliest forms of language.
That's the deep background, exactly. Archaeologists use everything they can find. Remnants of shelters, tools made from stone and bone, evidence of diet from plants, animals, even, early forms of symbolic expression. They pieced together how these early, highly mobile people lived. And fire and the development of language, those were absolutely critical steps in that early phase, definitely.
And then somewhere around, 10,000 years ago, something absolutely revolutionary starts happening. What was that fundamental shift? Well, the sources really highlight the gradual but ultimately transformative move towards settled agriculture. Instead of just finding and collecting food, people began actively growing it. They learned to understand cycles, plant seeds, manage crops. It was a whole new way of thinking about sustenance.
So like the focused cultivation of wheat and barley taking root in West Asia, or millet and rice appearing in East Asia around the same kind of time.
Exactly. And it wasn't like one single invention happening everywhere at once. It was lots of different people in different places figuring out how to coax food reliably from the earth. And right alongside that, they began domesticating animals.
Right.
Sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, donkeys initially. And later, depending on the region, things like chickens, water buffalo, horses.
Wow.
And this agricultural revolution also spurred other innovations, like weaving fibers into cloth, cotton, flax, wool.
So textiles came along pretty early, too.
Exactly. It was all sort of part of this agricultural package, you could say.
And the sources point to animal power coming in around 5,000 years ago, harnessing cattle and donkeys to pull plows and carts.
Yeah.
That must have multiplied productivity exponentially.
Oh, it changed everything. Farming fundamentally ties you to the land. You have to stay with your crops until they ripen. So settled life became not just possible, but really necessary for successful agriculture. And of course, with settling comes building more permanent structures, homes, storage.
Which brings us to things like pottery. The sources emphasize this as vital for storing all that grain and other cultivated food, and also for cooking the new grains, which often needed specific preparation to be digestible, right?
Absolutely. It's fascinating how much attention the sources imply was given even then to making food palatable. A timeless concern, isn't it?
It really is.
And, stone tools didn't just disappear overnight, but they evolved. Alongside the older flaking methods, we start seeing tools being smoothened and polished by grinding. Think about the effort that went into making a perfect mortar and pestle for grinding grain, or durable axes and hoes for clearing fields.
Yeah, that's a lot of work.
It is.
And metal starts to peek through, too, tapping into ores like copper and tin. The sources even note that the beautiful blue-green color of copper ore was sometimes valued just for how it looked.
Yeah, maybe paving the way for recognizing its other properties later on. That early exploration of metals was key, definitely. It led to more widespread use in tools and ornaments down the line. And the sources also give us these glimpses of increasing contact and trade. You find evidence of materials like wood, precious and semi-precious stones, metals, shell, even volcanic lava, showing up really far from their origin points.
So this wasn't just isolated pockets developing things. People were moving around.
Oh, for sure.
Carrying goods, and crucially, carrying ideas across distances.
Precisely. And this whole cumulative process over thousands of years, basic agriculture, settled villages, better productivity, new technologies, growing trade, It created the conditions for the next massive leap, the emergence of the very first cities. Some scholars call this the urban revolution because it truly transformed human life on a scale not seen since agriculture itself.
Right.
Here we really see the deep foundations of the complex, interconnected societies we live in today.
Okay, and according to the sources, where did city life truly begin? Where is ground zero for this urban revolution?
Right in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. This region, nestled between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, it just became this cradle of urban civilization. It was renowned for its prosperity, its sophisticated culture, and these stunning advancements in fields like mathematics and astronomy.
It's incredible how influential this one region was. The sources show its writing system, its literature spreading widely across the ancient Near East after about 2000 BCE.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Impacting languages, administration, even diplomatic communications, all the way to Egypt.
And the history itself is so layered, isn't it? You have different powers rising and falling. Sumerian city-states in the south, then the Akkadians uniting them, then Babylonia, and later Assyria up in the north.
And the language is changing too, from the unique Sumerian to the Semitic Akkadian languages, and eventually Aramaic filtering in.
That's right. It's a complex tapestry.
The archaeology there has a long history too, right? Back to the 1840s, sites like Uruk and Mari weren't just quick digs, they were excavated for decades.
Yeah, decades. Yielding just astonishing amounts of material, not just, grand monuments or treasures, but thousands upon thousands of written documents, ordinary tools, seals, everyday objects.
It's interesting the sources mention that European interest initially was heavily influenced by references in the Old Testament.
It was. Things like Shamar as a land of brick cities or the flood story.
Yeah, and apparently early excavators sometimes trying to find literal proof of those stories.
They did in the early days. But by the 1960s or so, the focus shifted dramatically. The understanding evolved. They started to see these narratives as maybe reflecting collective memories of profound changes, But the real work became reconstructing the lives of everyone using much more rigorous scientific techniques.
Right. It became less about proving a specific text and more about understanding the whole society through its material culture.
Exactly. Much more holistic.
So looking at the geography again, southern Mesopotamia, where the first cities emerged, it's largely desert today. How on earth did complex urban centers thrive there?
That's where the rivers are absolutely key, the Euphrates and Tigris. They carried vast amounts of incredibly fertile silt down from the mountains in the north. When those rivers flooded, or when people started managing them through extensive irrigation systems.
Ah, irrigation.
Yeah, that silt transformed the seemingly barren desert into incredibly productive farmland. The sources actually emphasize that agriculture in southern Mesopotamia was arguably the most productive of any ancient system, even surpassing the Roman Empire later on.
Wow. Okay, so a massive agricultural surplus was clearly a necessary foundation, but the sources make it clear that cities weren't just about having piles of food. What was the real urban difference?
This is a crucial insight from the sources. Cities are not just overgrown villages, they're fundamentally different, economically speaking. An urban economy develops these sophisticated spheres beyond just food production. You get specialized crafts, manufacturing, trade, services.
Right.
And this creates this intricate network of interdependencies. City dwellers, by and large, cannot feed themselves directly. They rely entirely on others, farmers out in the countryside producing the food, traders bringing in raw materials, craftsmen making the tools and goods they need.
So it's that division of labor we talked about earlier, but on a much larger, more specialized scale, like a stone seal carver needing bronze tools they didn't make themselves.
Exactly.
And special stones they didn't source and relying on others for food and everything else.
Precisely. And managing that level of interdependence, it requires sophisticated social organization. You need ways to coordinate the movement of all these resources, food from the countryside, raw materials like stone, metal, wood, often from distant sources. You need to store them, distribute goods, manage transactions involving large numbers of people. It's complex.
Okay, so you need coordination, someone in charge almost. Hierarchies start to emerge.
Exactly. You see hierarchies developing where some people give commands and others follow. It becomes necessary for things to function smoothly.
And this organization, this sheer complexity, this is where writing comes in, isn't it?
Absolutely. This is where the sources give us one of the most profound insights, I think. Writing didn't just emerge out of, a desire to write poetry or tell grand stories.
Yeah.
The very earliest written documents we have from Mesopotamia, from around 3200 BCE, in places like Uruk, They are overwhelmingly practical. They are lists.
Just lists of what?
Okay. Around 5,000 examples found at Uruk are basically simple pictographic signs and numbers. They represent goods, oxen, fish, bread loaves. Essentially, they're records of things coming into or going out of the temples.
So, the incredible invention of writing, one of humanity's most significant achievements. It seems to have been born out of the mundane, almost bureaucratic need to keep track of stuff in a complex urban economy. That's kind of surprising.
It's a powerful reminder of the practical drivers of innovation in these early cities, isn't it? And the medium they used, these clay tablets, was ingenious for its time. Scribes would take wet clay, shape it, and press marks into it with a cut reed stylus. The signs were initially picture-like, but they quickly evolved into those characteristic wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform.
Cuneiform, right.
And once dried in the sun, these tablets were incredibly durable, lasting thousands of years.
And easily disposable if the record wasn't needed anymore, I suppose. Since you had to write on wet clay, each transaction probably needed a new tablet.
Which is precisely why archaeologists find them by the hundreds, sometimes even entire rooms filled with discarded tablets. This sheer abundance of written material is a key reason why we have such a detailed understanding of ancient Mesopotamia compared to, say, contemporary India or other places.
Right, that makes sense. The sources note that by about 2600 BCE, the signs had become more abstract, truly cuneiform, and the language being recorded was Sumerian. What other uses did writing acquire as it evolved beyond just lists?
Oh, it expanded dramatically, beyond just accounting. We see the creation of vocabulary lists and dictionaries, which is crucial for standardizing and transmitting knowledge. Writing started being used to give legal validity to things like land transfers.
Okay.
To narrate the deeds of kings, very important for propaganda and history, and to announce changes to laws for everyone to know.
Sumerian eventually faded as a spoken language, right? Replaced by Akkadian around 2400 BCE.
That's right, a Semitic language.
But the cuneiform script itself adapted to Akkadian and was used for over 2,000 more years, until the 1st century CE. That's incredible longevity.
It was a remarkably flexible and adaptable script, but it was complex. Signs could represent whole words or specific syllables, not like our alphabet. So a skilled scribe had to master hundreds of signs, maybe more, and they had to write quickly before the clay dried.
Wow.
It was a demanding craft. And just thinking about how to visually represent the sounds of a language, that was a huge intellectual leap in itself.
Yeah, no kidding. Given that complexity, literacy must have been extremely limited, right?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very low. The sources even mention kings boasting about being able to read cuneiform. That tells you something. For most people, writing was something they experienced when documents were read out loud to them, like an official beginning a letter to the king with, "To my lord so-and-so speak, thus says your servant so-and-so." It was performed. But important texts like mythical poems were also copied and likely discussed or recited even among those who couldn't read themselves. So knowledge still spread.
There's an ancient Sumerian epic the sources highlight about King Enmerkar of Uruk that seems to directly link writing, city life, and trade. What does that story reveal?
It's a fantastic story, and it really resonates with the archaeological picture we have. The epic describes Enmerkar, the king of Uruk, wanting to organize a long-distance trade mission. He needs to get precious materials like lapis lazuli and metals from a distant land called Arata to beautify a temple.
Okay.
So he sends his messenger back and forth carrying these increasingly complex spoken messages. Eventually, the messenger just gets utterly exhausted, weary of mouth, as the epic says. He can't remember everything accurately.
The limits of memory. And this is the legendary moment of invention.
According to the epic, yes. Enmerkar, frustrated, takes a lump of clay, smooths it, and writes the message down. He invents writing right there on the spot because, as the text notes, in those days there had been no writing down of words on clay.
Wow.
And when the ruler of Arata gets this tablet, he's initially baffled. He examines the clay and frowns, calling the cuneiform marks nails because of their wedge shape.
So while it's probably not historically literal, the story itself tells us how the Mesopotamians saw writing. They linked its invention directly to the needs of complex, long-distance trade, organized by their powerful city rulers.
Exactly.
And they saw it as a hallmark, a sign of their own sophisticated urban culture compared to others.
Precisely. It was deeply integrated into their understanding of kingship, civilization, and what made their cities special.
Okay, let's step inside those early cities then. The sources suggest that in southern Mesopotamia, starting way back around 5000 BCE, these centers often grew up around temples.
That's the picture we get, yeah. Initially, temples were pretty simple structures, shrines made of unbaked bricks. They were seen quite literally as the residences of the city's patron gods, like the moon god Nana in Ur, or Inanna, the goddess of love and war, in Uruk. But over time, these structures became much, much grander, built of fired brick with large courtyards and these distinctive, elaborate outer walls with niches and buttresses that really set them apart from ordinary buildings.
And the god was seen as the theoretical head of the whole community, the center of worship, receiving offerings. The sources even mention early temple floors with astonishingly thick layers of fish bones.
Yeah, it's a vivid detail, isn't it? Shows the importance of offerings and how central the river economy was. The core belief was that the god was the ultimate owner of the community's resources, the fields, the fisheries, the herds. And over time, the temple's role expanded dramatically beyond just worship. It became a major economic institution, organizing production outside individual households, employing specialized workers like weavers or brewers, coordinating long-distance trade for essential materials.
Right.
And, crucially, using those new written records we talked about to manage the distribution of goods, grain, animals, bread, beer to its large workforce.
So the temple wasn't just a religious center. It was kind of like the central bank, the main granary, and the biggest employer all rolled into one.
In many ways, yes. It gradually became the central urban institution, especially in the early periods. But even with this highly productive agriculture and fairly centralized management, life wasn't always smooth sailing. The sources point to significant environmental challenges. Unpredictable flooding from the rivers could be devastating. Rivers could also change course over time, leaving a settlement high and dry.
And man-made problems too, right? Like upstream communities diverting too much water or letting silt choke the irrigation channels downstream.
Exactly. Water management was a constant issue. And this inevitably led to conflict, didn't it? Repeated disputes over vital land and water resources.
It did. And the sources suggest this constant background noise of conflict played a key role in the rise of powerful secular leaders, distinct from the temple priests.
Successful war chiefs gained influence by distributing loot captured in battle, taking prisoners who could become guards or laborers for them, increasing their personal wealth and following.
Okay, so how did a successful war leader make that jump to becoming a stable, maybe even hereditary king? It seems like more than just military might is needed.
That's a key point. The sources hint that it wasn't just about military power, though that was crucial. When these leaders started using their resources and success to benefit the entire community, things like offering precious captured goods to the gods to beautify the city's temples, or organizing the difficult procurement of necessary materials like stone and metal from abroad, and managing the city's growing wealth and distribution effectively, maybe using that newfangled accounting.
Right.
They gained not just raw power, but legitimate authority to command. People saw them as benefiting the whole city. Remember that Emmerkar epic we discussed? It connects kingship directly to organizing trade and using writing to manage it. That reflects this idea.
It paints a picture of leaders consolidating power partly by making the city safer and more prosperous, maybe encouraging people to settle nearby for protection and also to be available for large-scale projects or military service when needed.
Exactly. You see this kind of population shift happening dramatically at Uruk. Around 3000 BCE, the city just ballooned in size, reaching about 250 hectares, which is huge for the time. And at the same time, many smaller surrounding villages were apparently abandoned. People were actively moving into the city.
For safety and opportunity.
Presumably. Uruk also developed a defensive wall relatively early on, and it just kept growing, maybe reaching 400 hectares by 2800 BCE, a truly massive settlement.
And the labor for those walls, for building the huge temples, it was compulsory, wasn't it? The sources say it wasn't based on agricultural tax, but rather required service, with workers paid in rations.
Yes, that seems to be the system. War captives and local citizens owed labor service, either to the temple or to the ruler, and they were paid in basic subsistence. Rations, usually grain, maybe some cloth, oil. We have hundreds of surviving ration lists detailing this, which is remarkable evidence.
Incredible.
And the scale of these projects was immense. One estimate for building just 1 meter temple complex suggests it might have taken 1,500 men working 10 hours a day for 5 years. Huge mobilization.
Wow. The sources also link the ruler's ability to command this kind of labor to a flurry of technical advances we see in Uruk around 3000 BCE.
Yeah, there seems to be a connection. We see things like bronze tools becoming much more widespread, used for all sorts of crafts. Bronze is harder than copper, more effective. Architects got really creative because good timber for large roof spans was scarce in southern Mesopotamia. They developed ways to build massive halls using brick columns, which was a major structural innovation.
Clever.
And they created these stunning, colorful wall decorations using mosaics made from thousands of small painted clay cones pressed into the wet mud brick walls. Very distinctive. Plus, they began producing monumental sculpture, often using expensive imported stone, which again points to organized procurement.
And a technology particularly suited for the urban economy. The sources mention the potter's wheel.
Absolutely. The sources highlight this as a technological landmark. It wasn't just a fancy new tool. It enabled specialized workshops within the city to mass-produce standardized pottery quickly and efficiently. Think about how essential that would be for storing, transporting, and distributing all the goods moving around in a large, complex urban center.
Yeah, mass production becomes key. Speaking of distinctive urban artifacts, the cylinder seal sounds fascinating. Can you tell us more about those?
Oh, they are absolutely iconic Mesopotamian artifacts. Unlike the simple stamped seals used in many other cultures, Mesopotamians carved intricate designs, often narrative scenes or patterns, onto small stone cylinders, usually made of hard, sometimes semi-precious stone. When you rolled this cylinder over wet clay, say, on a jar stopper or a document, it created a continuous repeating picture, a sort of infinite frieze. They weren't just decorative. They had very practical functions. They were used to seal containers of goods to prevent tampering, kind of like a security measure. And they were used to authenticate documents, essentially acting like a signature. They often carried the owner's name, maybe their profession, the god they worshipped, or their official position.
So like a personal identifier.
Exactly. It was truly a mark of a city dweller's specific role and identity within that complex public life. A very urban thing.
Let's talk about daily life. What do the sources tell us about ordinary people living in these cities? It must be harder to reconstruct than the lives of kings and priests.
It is harder, but we get glimpses, definitely. Legal texts dealing with things like inheritance, marriage contracts, property disputes, those give us clues. Combined with archaeological excavations of residential areas, particularly the extensive work done at Ur back in the 1930s, they paint a partial picture.
So what does that picture look like?
Well, the nuclear family seems to have been the basic social and economic unit. Though it wasn't uncommon for a married son to continue living with his parents in the family home, the father was clearly the legal head of the household. We see details about marriage customs, things like formal declarations of intent, the need for parental consent, the exchange of gifts between families, shared meals signifying the union, making offerings at the temple.
So fairly formalized procedures.
Seems so. And property, especially land and the house itself, was typically passed down through the male line to the sons.
And the actual houses at Ur. The excavations paint a vivid picture, don't they? Narrow, winding streets, which suggests wheeled carts couldn't easily navigate many areas, so goods probably moved around by donkey pack.
That seems likely, yes. And the irregular shapes of the house plots suggest the cities often grew organically, without a strict grid plan or, what we'd call town planning.
And a striking detail from the sources, unlike contemporary cities over in the Indus Valley like Mohenjo-Daro, there were apparently no street drains in Mesopotamian cities like Ur.
That's right. Instead, drains and clay pipes were found inside the houses, in the inner courtyards. The roofs sloped inwards, channeling rainwater into these courtyards and then down into underground sumps or pits.
Ah, so they manage water within the house plot.
Exactly. This probably helped keep the unpaved streets outside from becoming absolute quagmires during rainy periods, but people still seem to have swept their household refuse out into the streets. Yeah, causing the street levels to gradually rise over time. So you see evidence of doorways and thresholds having to be constantly raised to keep up.
That's amazing. The houses were typically designed around these central courtyards, right? Which provided light and air.
And privacy, yeah. Away from those narrow, potentially messy streets.
And I loved the detail about superstitions recorded on omen tablets found at Ur. Things like believing a raised threshold would bring wealth.
Yes.
Or that if your front door happened to open outwards instead of inwards, it meant your wife would be a torment to you.
Little human touches like that, they really resonate across the millennia, don't they? Those everyday beliefs and anxieties.
They really do. What about burial practices?
They seem to have varied. There's evidence for formal town cemeteries where royalty and commoners might be buried, but there's also evidence of individuals being buried right under the floors of their own houses. More intimate connection to ancestors, perhaps.
Interesting. Okay, the sources also take us upstream to Mari, a different kind of city on the Euphrates. It was located in a zone where pastoralism, herding was really important, alongside agriculture. How did life there differ from the big southern cities like Uruk or Ur?
Mari's location was key. It was right on the interface between the intensively cultivated river valleys and the drier steppe lands more suitable for grazing animals. So agriculture and animal rearing, especially sheep and goats, existed very closely side by side. Many communities in that region probably had both farmers and herders within them, but a lot of the surrounding territory was primarily used for pasture.
And this relationship between farmers and herders, the sources suggest it was complex, interdependent, but also prone to conflict.
Absolutely. On the one hand, they needed each other. Herders needed grain, metal tools, maybe finished textiles from the settled communities. Farmers benefited from manure from the flocks and maybe animal products like wool or milk. But conflict was also common. Disputes over grazing rights, flocks accidentally damaging crops, or sometimes herders raiding settled villages or caravan routes. It was a constant tension.
And the sources mention that throughout Mesopotamian history, there was this constant flow of nomadic or semi-nomadic groups, often from the western desert regions, filtering into the settled agricultural areas.
Yes, that's a really important dynamic. These groups would come in sometimes as herders seeking pasture, sometimes as harvest laborers, sometimes as mercenaries or soldiers.
And sometimes they'd settle down, become prosperous, integrated, and eventually even establish their own rule, like the Amorites, who became the ruling dynasty at Mari itself.
Precisely. The kings of Mari we know most about were Amorites. This dynamic interaction and frankly intermixture of different peoples and cultures, settled farmers, urban dwellers, nomadic or semi-nomadic herders, it's a recurring theme, and it contributed significantly to the vitality and complexity of Mesopotamian civilization. Even those Amorite kings at Mari, while they certainly adopted and respected Mesopotamian gods and culture, also maintained a major temple for Dagon, who was specifically seen as a god of the steppe, acknowledging their pastoral heritage.
That's fascinating. The palace at Mari sounds incredibly impressive from the descriptions.
Oh, it was vast. Excavations revealed it was much more than just a royal residence. It was the administrative heart of the kingdom, a major center for production, especially crafting luxury goods from precious metals, and it was apparently famous enough in its time that rulers from distant regions like Syria actually visited it. We have daily food lists found there that reveal the enormous quantities of food and drink prepared just for the king's table and his immediate court. Gives you a sense of the scale. And its layout, with a single, heavily guarded entrance leading into multiple large paved courtyards, and eventually a grand audience hall decorated with elaborate wall paintings. It just speaks volumes about centralized power and careful organization.
And archaeologists could even identify specific rooms, like kitchens, based on the finds, charred fish bones, evidence of dung cake being used as fuel.
Yes, exactly. The sources highlight how archaeological methods have become increasingly sophisticated over time. It's not just about finding big walls anymore. Techniques like carefully scraping down surfaces layer by layer, sieving all the excavated earth to recover tiny remains like fish scales, seeds, or small animal bones, and detailed study of floor deposits. They allow us to reconstruct daily life with astonishing detail. Things like diet, specific activities happening in different areas.
Even figuring out which rooms were likely roofed based on weathering patterns.
Right. And finding tiny teeth of young pigs scattered in street deposits in some Mesopotamian towns even suggested that, much like in some parts of the world today, pigs probably roamed freely through the streets, acting as sort of four-legged garbage disposals.
Huh. That paints a picture. It's clear from the sources, though, that despite the challenges, the dirt, the floods, the conflict, Mesopotamians seem to deeply value city life itself.
They really did. They wrote poetry, celebrating their cities, lamenting their destruction if it happened, and even fondly remembering them centuries after they might have declined. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the world's oldest great works of literature, originating from Uruk. It ends quite profoundly, not with the hero Gilgamesh finding immortality or ultimate cosmic wisdom somewhere else, but with him returning to his city, Uruk, and finding genuine consolation and pride in simply admiring the massive, well-built city wall that he and his people had constructed.
That's powerful. The city itself becomes the legacy.
It's a powerful statement about the cultural significance of the physical city as a source of identity, achievement, and enduring meaning.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. Looking beyond the specifics of urban life, that invention of writing in Mesopotamia had incredible ripple effects, didn't it? The sources point to its foundational role in developing things like science, scholarly traditions, timekeeping, mathematics.
Absolutely. Science, and really any kind of complex cumulative knowledge, requires a way to record information accurately, so scholars can access, critique, and build upon the work of previous generations. Mesopotamia gave us truly enduring scholarly traditions, particularly in mathematics and in how we reckon time.
Like those tablets from around 1800 BCE, the sources mention they had complex multiplication and division tables, even tables of squares and square roots, calculations for compound interest.
Yeah, pretty sophisticated stuff. And their approximation for the square root of 2, for example, was incredibly accurate for the time. Shows advanced mathematical thinking.
And think about something we just take completely for granted today, our system of time.
Right, the division of the year into 12 months, roughly based on the moon cycles.
The month into weeks, the day into 24 hours, the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds.
That whole sexagesimal base 60 system for time and angles that comes directly to us from the Mesopotamians.
Wow.
It spread to the Hellenistic world after Alexander, then to the Roman world, into Islamic scholarship, and eventually reached medieval Europe and became our global standard.
That's an incredible legacy. They also meticulously recorded astronomical observations, didn't they? Tracking eclipses, star, and planet positions.
Yes, they kept detailed records over long periods, essential for developing predictive astronomy and astrology, which were closely linked back then. And none of these scientific and mathematical achievements would have been possible without writing, obviously, but also crucially without the urban institution of schools, or edubas, tablet houses as they called them.
Right, you needed places to train the scribes.
Exactly. Schools were essential for training scribes not just to read and write, but also to copy existing texts accurately, preserving knowledge. And these schools also fostered the intellectuals, the scholars, who could then build upon that vast library of written material created over centuries. They were centers of learning.
The sources also show that this interest in the past, this preservation of knowledge, wasn't just something modern historians imposed. Mesopotamians themselves had a strong interest in their own deep history. There were deliberate efforts, even in antiquity, to preserve older texts and traditions.
A prime example the sources give is Assurbanipal. He was the last major king of the vast Assyrian Empire, ruling in the 7th century BCE. Now, the Assyrians were based in the north and sometimes had a contentious relationship with Babylonia in the south. But Assurbanipal deeply respected Babylonia as the ancient heartland of their shared high culture and learning.
Okay.
So he systematically set out to collect a massive library at his capital, Nineveh. He wanted copies of everything important from the Mesopotamian tradition.
And he sent scribes specifically to the southern cities, places like Babylon and Uruk, which were known for their ancient temples and scribal schools with old collections.
Exactly. He sent them south to find and copy important ancient tablets. And because Sumerian, remember, the language of the earliest texts, although it hadn't been spoken regularly for over 1,000 years by Assurbanipal's time.
Right, since about 1800 BCE.
It was still taught in scribal schools.
Mm-hmm.
They learned it through vocabulary lists and bilingual Sumerian Akkadian texts. So scribes in the 7th century BCE could still read and understand cuneiform texts written way back in the 3rd or early 2nd millennium BCE.
That's incredible continuity.
It is. So Assurbanipal's men knew what they were looking for and could identify important ancient works.
His library at Nineveh was enormous for the time, wasn't it? Something like 1,000 distinct texts, maybe amounting to 30,000 individual tablets.
Yeah, huge numbers, covering everything from history and royal annals to epics like Gilgamesh, omen collections, astrology, religious hymns, lexical lists, the whole gamut of Mesopotamian knowledge.
And they even had a system of cataloging, with clay labels identifying the subject and scribe.
Yes, like little library tags. It shows a real conscious effort to organize and preserve this knowledge. Assurbanipal himself actually wrote about his motivation. He said he was doing it to gain knowledge, to understand the wisdom of the gods and the lessons of the past, for the benefit of his own life, his soul, and the stability of his throne. It was a deliberate act of cultural preservation for political and personal reasons.
Fascinating. There's also that story the sources mention about Nabonidus, who was the very last independent Babylonian king before the Persians conquered Babylon. He acted almost like an early archaeologist himself.
That's another great example of this conscious connection to the deep past. Apparently, Nabonidus had a dream telling him to restore a particular religious cult at Ur, the ancient city of the moon god. But the specific office of high priestess required for this cult had been forgotten over the centuries. No one knew exactly how she should be appointed or what rituals were involved, even what she should wear.
So what did he do?
He ordered searches in the temple archives and ruins, and eventually they found a foundation stele, a carved stone monument that had been buried by a much, much earlier king, a king whom modern scholars would date to over 1,100 years before Nabonidus' time.
Wow.
And this ancient stele actually depicted the high priestess from that long-ago era, showing her distinctive ceremonial clothing and jewelry. Nabonidus used this ancient image as a guide to correctly dress his own daughter when he consecrated her to revive that ancient office.
That's incredible, using archaeological evidence to restore a tradition.
Isn't it? And the sources add that he even found a broken statue of the really ancient king, Sargon of Akkad, who ruled maybe 1,700 years before him. And he had his craftsmen carefully repair it out of, as the inscription says, reverence for the gods and respect for kingship.
These stories really highlight a deep, conscious connection to their own history and traditions, stretching back millennia. It wasn't just a vague sense of the past, they actively engaged with it.
Exactly, a profound historical consciousness.
Yeah. So, stepping back again. From these complex city-states like Uruk and Ur, and early kingdoms like the Akkadian Empire founded by Sargon, what happens on the larger political scale? The sources briefly touch on the rise of massive empires over the next couple of millennia.
Right. The organizational principles and technologies developed in the city-states administration, writing, military organization, resource management, they get scaled up. We see repeated attempts at territorial control and empire building across the entire Near East and Mediterranean region.
Like the Assyrians themselves, who built a huge empire before Assurbanipal.
Yes. Then the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, then the Persians, or Iranians, who conquered Babylon and created an even larger empire.
Followed by Alexander the Great's conquests, spreading Hellenistic Greek culture widely, but also interacting with and absorbing local traditions across his vast territory.
Then, of course, the Roman Empire emerges from a single city-state to dominate an immense territory spanning 3 continents, Europe, Africa, Asia. They maintained their Latin identity, but were also deeply influenced by Greek culture and eventually Christianized. Its later fragmentation, especially the collapse of the western half, is a major turning point in history.
And the lands of the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, are eventually largely absorbed into the expanding Arab Empire and its successors, leading to incredibly fruitful interactions between Greek, Roman, and Islamic intellectual traditions, especially in science and philosophy.
Absolutely. And importantly, the sources make sure to mention the significant role played by pastoral peoples, often originating from the steppes to the north and east. Groups like various Turkic tribes, and most dramatically, the Mongols under Genghis Khan and his successors.
Right. They weren't just external threats raiding the settled empires.
No, they were integral to the region's history. Sometimes attacking, yes, but also sometimes serving in armies, facilitating trade across Central Asia, and even establishing their own immense land empires. The Mongol Empire is highlighted as a key example, showing that vast, successful political structures weren't solely the domain of settled, city-based powers. They had different organizational strengths.
Looking across all these different empires, what seems to be a common driver for their expansion and maintenance?
Well, a consistent theme that emerges from the sources is the desire to control and benefit from the existing, long-established trading networks. These networks connect to the Mediterranean and Near East to lucrative regions further east like India and China. Controlling these routes meant controlling wealth. Running such large empires also required increasingly sophisticated administrative systems, taxation, communication, law, and diverse military organizations adapted to controlling vast territories and many different kinds of populations.
And while these later empires clearly built on many of the foundations laid by the earlier states, administrative techniques, writing systems, infrastructure like roads, the sources also note their inherent instability. They didn't last forever.
No, they didn't. Internal conflicts over resources, succession struggles among elites, the sheer difficulty of governing vast distances, these were constant challenges. And that complex, often fraught relationship with the northern and eastern pastoral peoples remained a dynamic factor. They were sometimes a source of manpower, trade goods, and military support for the empires, but also always a potential source of rivals or devastating invasions.
And finally, the sources highlight one more crucial factor in holding these vast, diverse entities together over time, the role of major unifying belief systems.
Absolutely. The rise and spread of major, often monotheistic or universalizing, religions like Christianity and later Islam provided a powerful shared identity. This could transcend local ethnic and linguistic differences, which was crucial for maintaining social cohesion across the incredibly diverse populations within these large empires. It offered a common cultural framework.
Wow. Okay, that was quite a journey. Taking that sweep from the earliest foraging humans through the development of agriculture and settled life into the complexity of the first cities with writing and specialized labor, and then seeing how that scaled up into vast continent-spanning empires. It really underscores just how interconnected all these developments were, doesn't it? Settled life enabling surplus, surplus enabling specialization, specialization requiring organization, organization demanding records, which leads to writing.
Exactly.
Which then facilitates larger scale administration, long distance trade, the accumulation of knowledge, all feeding into the potential for building these larger political structures.
What's truly remarkable when you look at it this way is how those fundamental innovations that emerged thousands and thousands of years ago in places like Mesopotamia, how they laid groundwork that directly influenced the course of societies and civilizations across continents for millennia afterwards. Things we absolutely take for granted every single day, from how we measure time on our watches to the basic structure of our cities, the necessity of written records for contracts or laws. They have their deep, deep roots in those early experiments in urban living and state formation.
Yeah, it would be so easy to just dismiss this as, dusty ancient history, irrelevant to our modern lives. But this deep dive really reveals just how profoundly the foundations of our modern world, our urban existence, our systems of trade and knowledge, even the ways we try to organize society politically are built upon the innovations and maybe also the problems faced by those very first city dwellers and state builders.
Think about that for just a moment. The sheer necessity that drove those ancient scribes to press wedges into life of clay 5,000 years ago, the immense challenge of coordinating resources and people in a growing city, the deep human desire to understand the world, track the stars, and preserve knowledge across generations. These aren't just historical footnotes. They are echoes of the very processes that shape the world we inhabit.
So here's something to consider as we wrap up, a thought for you to take away. Given how much of our fundamental organization, everything from the rhythm of our clocks and calendars, to the way our global economy relies on complex records and contracts, to the very idea of living together in cities, given how much of that stems directly from these early interactions between settled people, emerging trade, and the need for large-scale management, just how much of our present-day lives are still, at their absolute core, wrestling with the same fundamental problems and building, consciously or unconsciously, on the same kinds of innovations that emerged with the very first cities and empires thousands of years ago.
Something to ponder. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gives you a renewed sense of connection to that incredibly ancient yet profoundly relevant past.